now to our panel of experts. Dr. Oke Ikechukwu is a public communications expert and senior fellow at the Nnamdi Azikiwe University. Dr. Abiodun Adeniyi is a political affairs analyst and lecturer in communications at Bayes University, Abuja. And Mohammed Bello is a current affairs analyst and former editor of the Leadership newspaper in Nigeria. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. And I'll start with you because obviously you're sitting closest to me. What do you make of this conversation about terrorism and extreme, violent extremism in Africa?
First, to say that it is not surprising is only to be expected. And I believe it's traceable to three major factors: undeveloped human capital, poor quality leadership spanning about 40 years, and then environmental issues which poor governance has also compounded. At the level of human capital, you notice that Africa today boasts of a lower population of educated persons, if you take Nigeria as an instance, than before. And the structures that should have been put together by 40 years of government spending across the African states have only created a lot of millionaires and billionaires in dollars and pounds and euros of a class of African leaders. And so you find that at several levels, the issues are serious. The environment is undeveloped. Infrastructure is poor in most African states. Human capital development is the same thing. And then the economies have not evolved. If you notice, local economies that were there before the arrival of the white man, if you like, have all nearly disappeared in many places, particularly here in Nigeria. Rent-seeking has become the norm, whereby raw materials are the main issue, so that what would ordinarily have upgraded the average person to become part of the 21st century is not there. In addition, you have a consumption-driven elite that distributes rent collected from oil and raw materials, and then shares. And in addition, you have poorly developed human capital. So you then find that in most African states, if you take Nigeria for example, instead of the nation or the state creating citizens, it is creating miscreants. And it's fairly easy to use our example. More people find it necessary now to find less than lawful means to survive in Nigeria. Their representatives in government are not likely in touch with them. Government expenditure is in huge sums in Naira, but no impact on citizen welfare. So you are creating criminals instead of citizens. And the institutions of state that should control these things are overstretched. And so it's only natural. So what we are calling terrorism across Africa actually, in many cases, is opportunistic criminality arising from the emergence of small bands that have fallen outside the control of the state apparatus.
It's a very interesting point that you've made. And let me bring in Dr. Abiodun Adeniyi there to get your take on this, because it sounds almost, with all due respect to Dr. Ikechukwu there, as if we're overlooking the problem of the ideological angle to all of this, because even if the jihadist insurgents are driven almost entirely by poverty, that in itself is an important ideological factor.
Absolutely, and it's okay that he has given an helicopter view of what the problem is. Economics, problematic education, and crass and massive poverty. That's the economic condition is not right in the first place. And when the economic condition is not right, when the educational level is problematic, it creates a set of citizenry with a warped sense of belief, with their mind able to absorb anything, including ideologies around the apocalypse, ideologies that are maybe borders on the eschatological, on life after life, and maybe bliss after life, So this indoctrination, this doctrinal belief system is actually a problem, and it comes more for the one that is halfly educated. But let's not make the mistake to think that terrorism is essentially limited to Africa. It's okay that the UN is now calling attention to it. Terrorism is everywhere in the world. It's just that it is rising in Africa, and it is rising because our own is easily attributable.
And perhaps rising at a faster rate,
fine.
just to support what Dr.
Ikechukwu was saying. Because it's rising because of the economic problem. And it's okay, but if you look at how it has happened in the United States, in Western societies, and even in the Middle East, something else other than poverty, that the economy drove those ones, but they are sustained by some kind of doctrinal belief, But how do you deal with those doctrinal belief systems? How do you deal with that belief in the apocalypse, in life after life? That's a question really which I think education can deal with to some extent. But again, let's not be totalistic about thinking that the solution is just educational. We have seen situations where very educated people are said to be terrorists. The Hezbollah, for instance, the Hamas, many of them are very, very educated, but they are driven by an objective. That objective too does not make them classify themselves as terrorists in the way of freedom fighters.
Yeah.
So we need to be able to put these things in context. But the African one is actually unbecoming. And because we have a problem of underdevelopment, a problem of economics, for us to be having terrorism added to it, it's an added problem. It's one more problem that we cannot afford to.
In other words, you can't
really.
discount the fact of poverty in it. Let me bring you in, Mohamed Bello. Of course, as Dr. Abiodun was saying, we've seen in other parts of the world, not underestimating the ideology as sort of the fact that ideology is an important element in the radicalization and recruitment into jihadist groups. And that's not exclusive to the marginalized, although that seems to be the preponderant majority that you find in Africa. What is your experience?
Thank you very much, Charles. From my experience, ideology plays a great role in the proliferation of this crisis, wherever you find them, but more so in Africa and the Middle East, where the jihadist ideology of firebrand Salafism has taken it to a new height. And now, having said that, I have said it in several personal discussions that the problem we have not been able to address up till now with jihadism everywhere in the world is that of ideology. We have refused to look at what is the driving force behind this thing. Why would one say that he wants to die and he wants to kill people just like that? The reward is much more than otherworldly than this world. He believes that if he dies, he's going to get more reward in heaven, and there are so many things like Dr. Okechukwu has pointed out, marginalization, the issue of corruption, the issue of injustice. Wherever you find injustice, you're likely to find people reacting to those kind of injustices. Now, having said that, again, this conference that we are looking at started on the global scale in 2018, last year, and then from then it has moved on to the present stage that it is now regional, breaking out to regions, the first one in Asia and now in Africa. Now, the purpose of this is to focus on the objectives of the United Nations, 6 of them if you like. Key among them is the one that is trying to harness support for the global terrorism strategy of the United Nations, and then the upholding of its United Nations Security Council resolutions. Key among these resolutions is Resolution 1267, which came on stream in 2014. Now, that resolution makes it an offense for any individual and entity to support specifically Boko Haram financially or materially. Now, this includes provision of arms and recruits.
Yeah, but that's a pretty obvious thing, though,
Yes.
isn't it? I
Yes.
mean, we know that if you, terrorism is not something that anybody, broadly speaking, would want to support. Yes. I mean, I know you're quoting the resolution there, but let me just bring in Dr. Ikechukwu here before we go on a break. I didn't mean to interrupt you there. But, I mean, I suppose the other thing is the way that we fight so-called terrorism. Why is it so difficult to suppress insurgencies in spite of the military might that is often aimed at it? And I think that harkens back to what Dr. Adeniyi was saying, which is essentially the ideology part of it. Because if you look at the Sahel and the Horn, despite you know, the involvement of the U.S. and France. I mean, the U.S. was in Somalia for quite a long time. The French were in the Sahel regions. Military might has only produced limited results. And we've got 60 seconds before we go on a break.
Well,
and if you don't finish, you can talk about it.
Okay, that's not surprising, because when you talk about military might, remember that the terrorists are serviced by the arms and ammunition factories of the U.S. and all of Europe. So there's still an economy that needs to be run in the business of terrorism. Afghanistan, we know the same story. What I'm leading to up to with all of that is that when you talk about the ideological angle, you have today a world of largely collapsed values. The U.S. has the highest number of patients per psychiatrist or psychologist, so a lot of people are mentally unstable. They are given no alternatives, and there's a progressive reaffirmation of relativism across the globe. And so when somebody comes up with some kind of absolutist thesis and a new perception of man in an environment that has become largely, subterraneously atheistic, it becomes interesting.
Okay.
It gives many of the Hulu people some vision of a new reality.
I'm going to ask you to just hold that thought. I'm sorry about that. We'll continue when we come back. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our discussion about the growing problem of violent extremism in Africa. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anier-Calder. Now, stamping out the terrorist threat in Africa is proving monstrously difficult, which is why the United Nations chief has been in Africa seeking help for countries fighting terrorism in the region. Antonio Gutteres has been at a conference in Nairobi that's trying to understand the terror threats facing Africa and to promote ways of countering extremism on the continent. He urged donors to do more to support military and developmental efforts to stop violent extremism. Also addressing the conference was Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta, who described Africa-based extremist groups such as Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram as a cancer. In a moment, we'll get to the nuts and bolts of terrorism in Africa with our expert panel. But first, let's hear from President Uhuru Kenyatta speaking at that counter-terrorism conference in Nairobi.
Groups like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram have started showing that they are a cancer that starts in one region or one country and steadily grows from there, eventually having negative effects across not just that country, but neighboring ones within the region. Given this tendency for terror groups to spread their nefarious tentacles across borders, and given their stated goal of continent-wide oppression and subjugation, no African nation can rest easy, and we are all targets in the sight of terror groups. Terror groups have mutated and evolved. They now feature sophisticated public relations arms, covering their extremism and atrocities under the veneer of operating as quasi-governments and providing public goods akin to those provided by the state. They do this not for the benefit of the people subjugated under their tyrannical rule, but as a means of creating a false equivalency and respectability to their criminality. We cannot cede ground to such groups if we hope to build a prosperous and peaceful Africa where freedom and justice reign supreme.
Uhuru Kenyatta there, and with me in the studio is our panel of analysts. Dr. Oke Ikechukwu is a public communications expert and senior fellow at the Nnamdi Azikiwe University. Dr. Biodun Adeniyi is a political affairs analyst and lecturer in communications at Bayes University, Abuja. And Mohammed Bello is a current affairs analyst and former editor of Leadership newspaper in Nigeria. Thank you, gentlemen, for staying with us. And I'll come straight to you, Dr. Ikechukwu, because you were talking about why it is so difficult to suppress insurgencies in spite of the military might that's aimed at them.
Yeah, I would backtrack to the very conference at which Kenyatta spoke to say that it, if you like, probably at the risk of sounding extreme, is a pointless engagement. It's a conference of, and Bello referred to the resolutions. And like you said, when he made that point, he said it's fairly obvious that nobody should support terrorism. So these resolutions, and those are the conference, Kenyatta is telling us what we already know. 3 questions emerge. Question number 1, is terrorism a lucrative engagement for America and the West in terms of impact on their economies and job creation? The answer is yes. The American gun lobby is one of the most powerful institutions
That's
on
a good
earth
point.
today.
That's a very good point.
And therefore, anything that impacts negatively on the arms and ammunition industry, they're going to take you down, take down the government, if they like, blow the continent out of the map. That's number 1. Number 2, the African states you're talking about. When you're talking, okay, they've said we've had resolutions, everybody is angry, it's not about how you feel. What's the template for engagement? There's none. So the interventions are on paper. These conferences, those who are there, they are not really under personal threat. And so after that, everybody goes on. What's the summary of the point I'm making? It's fairly simple. Terrorism in Africa is fed by the current structure of the global economy, is reinforced by the fact that leadership in Africa has no strategic focus in terms of long-term perceptions and interests, is driven by the fact that those passing the resolutions and threatening to help Africa need terrorism to thrive. And what do I mean by that? There is, unlike here where you can speak of challenge of statistics, every existing company in most of these developed nations, their outputs are part of their regular inventory after each day of production. And so if I've produced, say, 400,000 rocket launchers, it's easy to find out where I've moved them to. So if they're really serious about that, arms and ammunition starvation will end terrorism in Africa.
Yeah, but just because somebody manufactures weapons doesn't mean that it's good. I mean, you're not using weapons. A lot of people are not using weapons. So that does not immediately mean
Doesn't
that
translate,
because,
yes.
just
But
because
the point
weapons
I'm
are
making,
there, you're
I'm
going
talking
to
about
use
now
them.
tracking.
Right.
Tracking will make it very possible,
Right.
very easy, because both in shipment and transportation, even by smuggling, the records are available. The point I'm making being that it is actually possible to intervene where it hurts the most, but that intervention is not likely to occur. We're going to have conferences like this talking about the interests of the globe, but the truth is that there is a cascade. First, value crisis is cascade into economic calamities and the emergence of alternate governments within governments that lobby and place governments, and then the need for a field of action to drive an economy.
Right.
All
Okay.
of that together is giving us what we
Right.
have
Let me
to
bring
know.
Dr. Adeniyi in. Essentially, the point is that, I mean, while if we take that stance or sort of take that position, it means that ordinary people are simply vulnerable to these extremists, are essentially sitting ducks, and you've got all these big businesses and big companies playing around with people's lives.
But I think I want to, with every due respect, I want to slightly depart from his standpoint, because I know that in dealing with terrorism, it's not just about hardware. That's why you said, irrespective of the military might of the authorities, we've not been able to deal with terrorism. Osama bin Laden was killed, but terrorism is still thriving. Abubakar Shekau has disappeared somewhere. We don't hear about him again. But Boko Haram is thriving, So military might is not enough. So hardware might not just be enough. And I don't believe that hardware comes from only the West. It also comes from it comes from different sources as well. And they are also local manufacturers. So there are different sources of these weapons, And some of the time they don't even use weapons. They don't use arms. They use other tactics. So, but the other aspect that we need to focus on is the psychological aspect of it. The clash of civilization, I beg your pardon. What is it that makes one person wants to live life as long as possible? And what is it that the other person thinks about and believes that life is irrelevant, and so he wants to take his life once and for all? What is that driving force? What is it that propels man to change? The innate desire of every man is to live for as long as possible. But that thing that propels some sections of human beings to think that they want to take their life and those of others is what I think should be engaged more by the authorities. That's dealing with the soft aspect of it. Soft aspect is very, very important because, you and I probably have access to weapons, but we have never used it. Some of us have never held a gun before, apart from holding it, apart from seeing it. And I doubt if there's anything you can do to ask me to hold a gun or to apply it against another person.
Absolutely.
And I will go ahead and do it. So it's about understanding, dealing with the psychological aspect of it, and preventing us, from welcoming violence, okay? Beyond using might, beyond using force, government authorities also have to do with the fundamental long-term issues that created terrorism in the first place. Because any kind of violence really is a byproduct, it's a reflection of the contradictions within the system. You know, so Africa is witnessing it more because the contradictions in Africa is much more. Contradictions at the level of education, at the level of economics, and at the level of other indices of development. Okay, so this soft aspect has to be dealt with before we begin to look at the military aspect. The military aspect historically has failed, but if the world fails to deal with the soft aspect, you know, other tangibles of development, then I'm afraid we'll just be begging the issue.
And Mohammed Bello, that sounds like a very critical point, made in different ways, but made by both Dr. Ikechukwu and Dr. Adeniyi there. Most of these conferences and these conversations are taking place without looking at the key issues. You quoted some of the resolutions there, and one of the key issues would have to be young people, isn't it? I mean, they're part of the meeting. I mean, you rarely find them being part of these meetings and part of the solution to bring their perspective into the conversation. And yet most of the people who are radicalized and most of the people who end up being extremists are young people.
Yeah, that's quite unfortunate, because one of the objectives of the United Nations for the convening of these conferences is that they want to dialogue with women and the youth. And in the process of doing that, it's like I said, unremarkable that we've not brought this category of people on board yet. It's very, very disturbing, and unless efforts are stemmed up and serious issues are taken into considerations, the problem is less likely to go away just like that. You remember Egypt, 1926. Hassan al-Banna was killed.
Well, I don't remember that far back.
Yeah. Hassan al-Banna was killed.
But I do understand what you mean.
By the Egyptian government, and they thought that they have dealt with the situation of the Islamic Brotherhood. And then in the 70s, Sayyid Qutb came up again. They killed Sayyid Qutb, and they thought they have dealt with the situation. And up until the Arab Spring, Morsi came on board, and the Islamic Brotherhood had its government in Egypt for the first time. What am I pointing at? I'm pointing at the fact that we are not dealing with terrorism, Islamic jihadism in particular, in the way we're supposed to deal with it. We're relying on the prescriptions of America and some other countries in the West to deal with local
That's
issues.
a very interesting line you've got there, and I'd very much like to explore that in some more detail when we come back, because it would be good to get your perspective if you think that it isn't a global way of tackling the problem. In other words, there are different ways that this has to be looked at, and that the Western way essentially has failed. Yes. And so it'll be interesting to see what your perspective is on a way that might work based on your own unique experience. Yes. And we'll talk about that when we come back. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead, including we continue our discussion about the growing problem of violent extremism in Africa. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyagoru. Now, last year in May, the Nigerian army said it had begun a final push against Boko Haram militants at their last major stronghold around Lake Chad in a military offensive known as Operation Last Hold. It was supposed to last approximately 4 months. Well, from all accounts, that attempt to uproot the insurgents from their various fortresses is still not over more than a year later. Far from it. We've been told that the militants have not only managed to regroup over and over again, but have turned many of the islands in the Lake Chad region and the extreme north of Borno State into their new stronghold. From there, They and their breakaway arm, the Islamic State in West Africa, or ISWAP, have been launching attacks on both the military and civilians. It's for all those reasons that the UN has been holding a high-level conference in Nairobi, gauging the seriousness of the terror threat in Africa. Here's a bit more of the discussion at that conference.
This is no ordinary enemy. Countries are now forced to address competing priorities: economic integration and trading war, the African continental area. Niger embodies the paradox of many Sahel countries forced to devote more than a third of their national budgets to fight terrorism at the expense of development. These countries already faced with the devastating effects of climate change, migration, and cross-border criminal economies from the trafficking of drugs, human beings, and human arms. That is why we insist that the United Nations Security Council, with a mandate to ensure global peace and security, should assume its responsibilities by allocating resources to fight terrorism in Africa. However, the security response alone is not the answer. The response should be sustainable development, in line with Agenda 2030 and Agenda 2063. That is why the African Union and the United Nations are now implementing a framework agreement for both peace and security and development as part of a holistic response to these shared global challenges.
That's a clip there from that UN conference taking place in Nairobi. Well, for more, let's speak now to our panel of analysts. Dr. Oke Ikechukwu is a public communications expert and senior fellow at the Nnamdi Azikiwe University. Dr. Biodun Adeniyi is a political affairs analyst and lecturer in communications at Bayes University. And Mohammed Bello is a current affairs analyst and former editor of the Leadership newspaper. And we were talking with you, Mohammed Bello. We were talking about the fact that everything from radicalization to violent extremism to terrorism are most often youth issues. And you were saying that the problem is that the approach is wrong.
Yes, the approach is wrong for very many reasons. Because we are not looking at the local issues that foment this crisis. We only take prescriptions from outside and then want to implement them in the country. For instance, some of the interventions that are going on currently in the Northeast are good, but at the same time, some of them are bad. For instance, there is a Washington-based company, Creative Associates International, which is also an outsourcer for the United States Agency for International Development. Currently, they are into trench digging in parts of Borno and Yobe states. And they had to pack up in Adamawa state because they weren't doing as much as they wanted to do. So, as much as this current trench digging is okay, but what's the purpose? Why are you digging trenches in this place? Is it a minor violation or is it a major violation on the territorial integrity of Nigeria, for instance? Is there a bilateral relationship between, say, US or the company and Nigeria that allows it to come and do that? Now, but it's going on. It's going on. Instead of focusing on addressing the humanitarian, the serious humanitarian crisis in the Northeast, the serious poverty issue in the Northeast, the climate issue in the Lake Chad region, for instance.
Well, they're looking at all of that.
No,
though,
they are looking at. No, it's not the conference I'm talking about.
Right.
I mean the
No,
practitioners.
I know. I mean the
practitioners,
policies that
yes,
are,
the practitioners on ground who are saying that they are helping to fight Boko Haram.
Right.
Now, if you ask me for a solution, a homegrown solution, I'll tell you this. Number one, scholars and pundits and government policymakers need to study the ideology that gave rise to this crisis, for instance. Muhammad Yusuf wrote 2 books before he died. One of them is available but very difficult to get. The other one has gone extinct. The one that has gone extinct is Al-Jihadu fi sabilillahi da'watul alamina. Jihad in the name of mankind, a role for everybody. Now, the first one is
when he says role for everybody, and I know the other two gentlemen are
for
itching
mankind,
to sort of leap in.
He generalized it. He said mankind.
Yeah.
Yes, he said jihad is for mankind. So you see how dangerous that kind of...
So the jihad that he's referring
Yes.
to, and I assume you have some knowledge of this book
Yes, yes.
that you're talking about, is essentially changing the circumstances of the way, sort of the way society is being run at the moment.
Yes.
Is that what you mean? Bettering the lot of, in other words, this issue of poverty and and all that sort of thing, and changing society for the better.
Exactly, but the methodology is extremely dangerous. Shekau has painted a picture of how to achieve that.
Right.
He said, kill everybody until the flag of jihad is raised above the land of Nigeria. Now, that narrative has not been looked into. And it's the same narrative that is in Hazihi Akedituna, Wamenhaju de Awatuna.
Right.
This is our creed, and this is our way of proselytizing, written by Muhammad Yusuf.
I'm going to bring in Dr. Ikechukwu there, because essentially it sounds like this is another way of saying, but in a different way with a sort of religious tinge to it, that the issues are about inequality and marginalization and people feeling excluded and not a part of the space, as it were, the discussion space that's going on.
Well, yes, he's talked about the ideology. The primary issue to raise is, what is it that makes me vulnerable to a new ideology? So if you want to take the case of Boko Haram, you look at that part of the country, how it came up, the role of some politicians, the poverty in the place, they ignored security reports about Boko Haram, and then the killing of their leaders, all of that together. And what it translates into is that you had a vulnerable environment where there were too many people who were not captured within the state, either in terms of religious engagement, at the level of religious ideology, or economic engagement. So they were vulnerable to begin with, and therefore available to recruitment. That recruitment was ignored, and it went on for quite a while. So whereas we can say, yes, there's the ideological element, that is correct. But ideological absorption of new members, you find that the conditions are almost the same. You can talk about poverty here. How about the people of Saudi Arabia? How about all of Arab? How about the US? Look at it. You have quite a large number of Arabs who are not comfortable with the royal family in Saudi Arabia. You have the US pretending to be driving world peace, but is seen as not believing in anything, whether divine or human. And so people are seeing a global context. In the data, globalization has thrown up a lot of relativity. And you're looking at this man who says he's a policeman. The policeman doesn't want us to take your tablet. But he takes anyone he likes. So all of a sudden, you don't say on everybody that, hey, hold on. I can maintain a platform on my own and drive it. That then makes it possible. And because there's also no structured engagement of the citizenry, you have, if you like, at the level of psychology, like he said, the re-emergence of a sense of identity and individuality is looking for anchorage. Unfortunately, the anchorage comes from several forms, each of them claiming to be an authority, and you, the observer, seeing that they actually be missed. Okay, what makes what you're saying different from this guy? I'll go with this guy. So at that level, then recruitment becomes possible, no matter the culture.
Yes.
And at the level of engagement, some of the things which our humanity will tell us is anathema, all of a sudden looks normal. The US can go over somewhere and take out a government, put somebody it doesn't like. He can put a Mobutu and allow him to ruin his country for over 30 years. And hold on, this policeman is actually a criminal. No, we have a book that tells us the difference between right and wrong, and it was brought by a messenger who is a divine messenger. We run with it. So it's what you might like, if you like, a contest of legitimacy, a rejection of the presumed legitimacy of the modern state, and the demand for a substitution. That's why in fighting insurgency, there's the mistaken assumption. If you recall, during Jonathan, there was an announcement that there had been a ceasefire, and that was part of a roundtable on the matter. Said that concept is self-contradictory in the interface with Boko Haram, because it's actually asking for time to regroup. This is an organization like any serious terrorist organization that is hoping to replace the state.
Right. Okay. Let me just bring in Dr. Abiodun Adeniyi before we go on a break. Essentially, part of the problem, from what I'm hearing, is that we have political systems that abuse power, basically, and marginalize the youth and push them not only to the margins of society, but to the very extremes of society.
Yeah, that's right. Charles, you see, I'm happy that we're trying not to pigeonhole these things to religion alone, because if you say religion, you will be tempted to driving out what kind of religion, which of the religion is more associated with these. But it's going to be dangerous to do that, because we have a group in Uganda called the Lord's Restoration
Lord's
Army, which is
Resistance Army.
yeah, that's fine. And we have another one at a point in time we're having this agitation from Niger Delta, you know, and a lot of them were classed as terrorists. You know, they were not religious; they were just ideological at the level of economics. And we'll probably want to ask ourselves the question: suppose, you know, attention had been paid by government to sections of our youth called Limajiri. You know, we're not talking about the educational purpose of the program, but the fact that they are deprived people begging for arms. Suppose they have been well catered for, will they have graduated to becoming an army of Boko Haram like it is being alleged in circles?
Okay. I'm going to ask you to just hold that thought. We'll
right.
come back to you after the break. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our discussion about the growing problem of violent extremism in Africa. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagoldo. Now, as that high-level conference on counter-terrorism has been taking place in Nairobi, Nigeria and its neighbors in the Lake Chad Basin are continuing to struggle to keep jihadist factions at bay. The vast Sahel region, which spreads coast to coast from across a band of northern Africa, is itself a haven for armed groups, from bandits to global extremist franchises. At one stage, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb seemed to be on the back foot, but has recently seen a mending of relations between its offshoots. They've recently announced that they are working with Al-Murabitun, led by the veteran Algerian jihadist Mukhtar Belmokhtar, to fight against France and its allies in the region. This, as Islamic State has continued its attempts to spread its dominance from North Africa to the Sahel. Well, in a moment, we'll continue our discussion with our panel of analysts about the growing problem of terrorism and violent extremism in Africa. But first, let's hear a bit more from that global counter-terrorism conference in Nairobi.
According to the Global Terrorism Index published by the Institute for Economics and Peace, first fact, less than 3% of terrorist attacks occurred in the OECD countries, for we can see that their effects are huge. An important aspect, let's go to the causes. IEP found an important correlation between terrorism and socioeconomic factors, such as youth unemployment levels, trust of the press and democracy, drug-related crimes, and attitudes to immigrants. According to this and other studies, in OECD countries, the only way to end terrorism from the root is to combat marginalization, inequality, and discrimination, and implement real policies of inclusion and belonging for young people.
That's a person contributing there to that conference in Nairobi. With me in the studio is our panel of analysts. Dr. Oke Ikechukwu is a public communications expert, senior fellow at the Nnamdi Azikiwe University. Dr. Abiodun Adeniyi is a political affairs analyst and lecturer in communications at Bayes University, Abuja. And Mohammed Bello is a current affairs analyst and former editor of Leadership newspaper in Nigeria. Thank you for staying with us. And Dr. Adeniyi, you were speaking before we went on a break. We're talking about the abuse of political systems across the continent, which is what is so frustrating for a lot of young people.
Absolutely, and I was going to make the point that terrorism, as bad as it is a reflection of the contradiction in society, and is a statement on the failure of leadership in systems. You know, anywhere you look at in the world, you know, the terrorists struck in America, because a section of the people consider themselves as outliers. So what made those sections to consider themselves as outliers? And I was going to ask that, you know, if the Almajiris or if the youths in Nigeria had been well catered for, you know, would they have graduated to becoming an army that will feed the Boko Haram group, for instance? I'm asking a question. They look at Niger Delta, for instance. Do those guys who came with arms, you know, if there was some kind of justice, some kind of conscious attempt to develop that area, would they have come up at all? So questions need to be asked, and that's why I'm saying that political leadership have to be much more responsive, you know, to seeing terrorism. Yes, it is very terrible, it is very ungodly, very unacceptable, but again, the statement in those acts of so-called acts of terrorism have to be addressed.
That's a very good point. And Mohammed Bello, should we, just based on what Dr. Adeni is saying there, should we look at our policies differently as part of efforts to find solutions and get away from this almost collective punishment of sort of youths that rather perversely pushes them to become radicalized even further and to have grievances against society?
Yes, that was what I was driving at in my earlier point. I was saying that if you look at this whole thing holistically, you realize that the solution that we need is not what is being brought to bear on the situation. Instead, we are regurgitating what others are telling us.
So what solutions would you suggest?
Yeah, the solution number one is you have to look at this issue. What is the foundation? How did it spring
Yeah,
up?
but we've been looking at that for many, many years.
Yeah, we've been looking at that.
What I want to understand, and I don't mean to interrupt you or put you under undue pressure, but what I want to understand is you are from the north,
yes,
which is an area where a lot of this has been taking place.
Yes.
And you've been a newspaper journalist, you're a credible voice from that part of Nigeria. You've looked at this for a long time. What is the solution? I mean, we know what the problem is. What is the solution?
I agree and disagree with you, Charles. We know the problem at the surface. We've not scratched, we have not dug
think we ought to go deeper?
Yes,
Right.
and find out what is really happening. If somebody tells you that, see, if you die, you don't have anything to lose. It is even better for you to die than to live. I mean, that is something to look at.
And that has great resonance
Yes,
when someone is in extreme poverty and deprivation.
Exactly.
Right.
So he has nothing to live for. So, but coming to the solution, if we want to look at it completely, holistically, number one, we have to realize that the ulamas, and then the Christian leaders. There is a book, current book by Dr. Ebenezer Obadari. He said he called it the Pentecostal Republic. He is referring to Nigeria, and I believe Pentecostal is Christian. So, it from two sides of the divide, Islam and Christianity and other religion is being manipulated.
Absolutely.
So
I think a lot of people would agree with that.
So we need to start looking at that. How do we harness the thoughts, the narratives, the babel of voices coming from the pulpit and from the mosques? How do we harness this?
In other words, is that deepening alienation,
yes,
you know, with youths and that sort of thing?
Yes, pushing people into doing things that they are
okay,
not
let me bring in Dr. Ikechukwu there. I mean, should we, for instance, because that's one thing that came out at this conference, should we, having recognized that a lot of young people are part of, I mean, they form the bulk of the radicalized people and so on, should we be aiming to put in place, for instance, younger governments that would be more responsive, certainly that would look, you know, to the young people as though their aims are being represented, that sort of thing, administrations with more young people in them to be in governance and leadership positions and to be able to hold government accountable?
You can have a government made up of biologically younger people, but who lack the capacity at two levels. One, their orientation is anti-environment, and then their trajectory will not work. Most of the young people you want to talk about, who could have probably appear at this conference and speak, many of them will have schooled abroad. They have no real contact with the community. And the next thing you hear, oh, imagine African leaders, and they are not trained to address African problems. So it's not about, I go back to the point I started with. Absence of proper leadership, collapsed environment, and then the crisis of the economy. And the solutions will not include, with all due respect, what we're hearing from the United Nations, because there are issues to be raised. All the solutions that the World Bank has proposed for Africa for the last 30, 40 years, please name one that has worked. One will do. And yet the countries are owing them. All the things, all the interventions the UN has made, from which it supplies us totally useless statistics. You're telling us for 12 years Nigerian population is 10 million out of school, whereas by our own 2005 census, over 40 million out of school. Now, what am I summing up with all of that? The solution will not include assuming that these resolutions in Nairobi can be brought here and implemented. Look around. He said that people were, you're promised that something better than what you have. There must be something missing in what you have for you to be available for that conversation.
Right, okay.
So those fundamental things that are missing have created a population that's available for a new ideology.
Okay, let me just, because we've got literally 1 minute left before the program runs out. I'll give you the final word, Dr. Abiodun Adeniyi. As things stand, does it look like terrorism and violent extremism will remain in Africa for some time to come?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. Unfortunately, yes. But the conscientious, painstaking attention has to be paid, to proper education that will lead to de-radicalization and de-indoctrination. Those things are very, very important. Appropriate education is very important, but because if you don't feed the mind will absorb whatever comes its way. And especially, it can be worse if we're talking about the youths, because the youths are the main population that feed the army of terrorists. Right. But we have to deal with them at the level of education before we talk about economics and all of that. Yeah.
Dr. Abiodun Adeniyi, Dr. Oke Ikechukwu, and Mohammed Bello, thank you very much indeed. Well, that's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again for a fresh edition tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching. Thank you very much.